Hi there, hi everyone. Welcome to Weekly10's Powerful Question session. I'm Chris, our head of people sites here at Weekly10. And just before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping before we get going properly. So we're recording today's event, so you'll get a link to the recording the next day or two, along with any resources that we mentioned throughout the session. We're also going to build in some time at the end of the session for a Q&A. So if you've got any questions at any stage, feel free to pop them in the chat down in the bottom right-hand corner. And once we get to the end of the session, we'll go through those. Okay, but without any further ado, let's get started. So, welcome to Powerful Questions, as I said before. Powerful Questions is really our way of kicking off some thinking and some theoretical ideas around the science behind question setting, what works well, what doesn't work well, and more importantly, to some regard, why. It's all about helping you ask the right questions to your people at the right time in the right way to collect really important, insightful, useful feedback. We're going to start quite general, and then as the session progresses, we'll sort of flow down towards more Weekly10 specific uses. So let's get going. So straight off the bat, why do we ask questions? Why do human beings ask questions? This was a big piece of research and a big question asked in the 1970s by two researchers from Brown University in the United States. And we found two key reasons for why us human beings are so into asking questions. One is really obvious. It's all about information exchange. It's, I don't understand something and I would like to understand what that thing is, so I'm going to ask a question around it. Number two, slightly less obviously, is all about impression management. I'm going to ask a question for you or to that group of people in order to shape the way in which you think or see me as an individual. Now, if we map that to today's HR challenges, they map really nicely to two key areas, which we can see here in orange. Information exchange is very clearly, very relevantly tied to employee feedback. It's about understanding what's going on within our business and what's happening with our people. Slightly less obviously, perhaps, and it certainly only makes up a small part of this area, but impression management really does tap into the idea that the employee experience, the way in which people think about work and see work really impacts the way they actually do work and enjoy that work. So by asking questions, potentially, there's a real option there or opportunity to shape employee experience. And why are questions important? Well, if you were to ask a doctor, a teacher, a journalist, or a lawyer about the importance of asking questions in the workplace, they'd be able to give you some really succinct, but detailed and quality answers in terms of the importance that questions play in their day-to-day work life. If you look at doctors in particular, the ability to ask and seek patient feedback is so vital to what they're doing that they'd be lost without it. In fact, here in the UK, the General Medical Council says if you want to run a medical degree course, you actually have to teach your students, your medical students, at least one module on patient feedback in order for them to turn around and say that they're certified. But if we ask this question, why are questions important? We ask that to the typical day-to-day office manager or PA or whoever it might be within the business, we might not get as detailed a answer. You might get a bit of a shrug of the shoulders and say, well, it's good to find things out. It's really important to understand why questions are useful, and pretty big areas here clearly are, but it spurs learning and exchange of ideas. We do understand what's going on in our business, which is a very obvious benefit. It can massively help improve things like innovation and performance. Just by asking a few simple questions, we can really open up those doors. And it also helps to build rapport, trust between team members and managers, leadership and employees. Just, by simply asking a few questions, listening and acting accordingly, we can really sort of build better cultural places to work. And the flip side of understanding why questions are really important to be asked in the workplace is kind of understanding how to ask a question. And it's really important that we do know that, because actually, what you find is if questions are asked in a bad way, whether that's inside the Weekly10 employee check-in, whether that's simply passing someone in a corridor, if you phrase your question in an incorrect way, it can have consequences which are fairly significant. If you were to ask a question, for example, which led people, a leading style question, what happens there is we start to collect really bad data. If we're leading someone towards a certain answer, we're not getting a truthful answer. We're getting an answer that we're essentially putting in the mouths of our people. Equally, biased or discriminatory language can have real impact in terms of the quality of data you get and how that can be skewed and not necessarily a truthful representation of what's going on. We can also do things like confusing people. So if we utilize language which is maybe a jargon term or particularly complex mathematical constructs, I mean, percentages are a classic one that although the vast majority of us might feel quite comfortable using a percentage, some people, a good proportion of the population, aren't quite as comfortable in sort of understanding percentages. So if we utilize a percentage or a piece of jargon in a question we ask and it confuses someone, well, that's really not very helpful for a couple of reasons. One, if somebody's confused, they might not give us a very accurate answer. And two, this leads on to point 4 here. It leads to this element of negativity in that process. You know, if I'm confusing people by asking them questions, they start to feel maybe a bit silly, maybe potentially a little uneducated or a little unexperienced enough to answer that question. And they start to formulate negative feelings towards not only the question that I've asked, but potentially me and the process of me asking questions again in the future. And the big reason, the big issue with that is it leads to this thing called avoidance. And avoidance is our brain's way of protecting us from harm at any one time. Now that might be really physical harm, so it might be not to touch a burning fire because we know it will hurt us, but it can also, and more oftenly is, around about emotional and mental harm. So it seems like if something does confuse us, that is a negative emotion. We don't like to feel negative emotions. And what our brain's doing, almost always without us understanding it or realizing it, our brain's going, like, well, this thing's not very good. We don't like this for reason X, Y, or Z. So next time we are having to go through this process, what we're going to do is come into it with more elements of negativity. We're going to think, oh, I don't really want to do this, or I'm going to push this back until next week, or I'm not going to do it at all. So asking questions in a bad way is a really important sort of area to understand and make sure that we avoid moving forward. Now, usually with this session, I usually deliver this session in a one-on-one scenario and deliver it to customers. And if you're ever interested in running more sort of one-to-one training sessions with the people science team, and please do reach out. And I usually ask this question at this stage, and what led us here? Because I really like to understand, what it is that you guys are facing out in your workplaces, what challenges, what issues, what blockers it is that Weekly10 can help you with, or employee feedback or performance tools can help you with. And these are obviously today it's a bit of a one-way affair. So here's a smattering of the typical answers I might get. Certainly this is not an exhaustive list, but we often hear things like, giving people a voice, improving engagement, streamlining performance. And it's interesting for me to understand it, but B, just to see where people are coming from in terms of the sort of challenge they're facing. And what I mean by that is, putting on my science hat here for a minute, it doesn't necessarily matter what the specific answer is that I get from any one client. What I'm trying to look at is where do these issues sit within frameworks that we apply here, both academically outside of Weekly10, but certainly within Weekly10, certain frameworks we have that help us better understand our customers' challenges and what their employees are going through. And here's one such framework. So what we're really talking about here, if people come to me and talk to me about the issues that they've got, whether it's engagement, performance, whatever it might be, what are we really talking about? Well, about 80% of the time, we're talking about some sort of behavioural challenge. It's we want our people to do more of X or less of Y, or we want to change the way in which we do Z. And these are typically speaking behavioural challenges. They're about doing things that we do. Pretty much the rest of that 20% is taken up by attitudinal challenges. So these are the ways in which people think and see their workplace and what they think about their workplace. So it's things like we want people to talk about us in a more positive light. We want our people to take more pride in their work. Things like that are typically attitudinal based, although certainly there's some bleed between the two. And now what I've uncovered here so far, these two circles, is 2/3 of a well-founded human motivational model. It's a model called the model of attitudinal consistency. And what that model says is that our behaviours, the things that we do, are impacted by our attitudes, the way in which we think. And our attitudes are impacted by this hidden third item, which are our perceptions, the way in which we see the world. So what we see shapes the way we think, which shapes the way we do. And we can apply this really nicely in most workplace scenarios because human beings are pretty by the book when it comes to what we do at work, and we do sort of get impacted in a very simplistic manner in the ways in which we work and behave. So to give you a really simple example of how this model might play out in a relatively generic HR scenario, we might want our employees to say something along the lines of, you know what, times are tight, deadlines are tight, work need me to put in an extra hour tonight, so I'm going to work an extra hour just to get project A or B done. What led to that employee having that behaviour? Well, it could be, and certainly it's not the only thing, but it could be the attitude that they believe their manager really cares about them. And they believe in reciprocity, so they say, well, if my manager cares about me, I'm going to care about my manager and the work that I'm doing when I need to. What led to that attitude? Well, it could be, and again, not solely this, but it certainly could be the perception that, you know, my manager is asking me frequently how I'm doing, what support do I need, how and in what way can my manager support me? And by asking those questions, they're giving me the perception that my manager really cares about me, so I should care back. So we can apply this really simple model to question setting, and the way in which we do that is we talk about every question at a behavioural level. So this is kind of ignoring the big elephant in the room, which is employee feedback, but this is more about the employee experience side. Every question at a behavioural level should do one of these 6 things that are on screen now. So it should create or shape a perception. It should measure or shift an attitude, or it should change or reinforce, if it's a positive behaviour, reinforce behaviours. So that's kind of the sciencey what the question should do, and that's kind of some of the behavioural science we apply. Then, as I said, there's an elephant in the room. The more obvious point is good questions should just simply provide really good feedback, feedback which alerts us to the good, the bad, the ugly, the things that we're missing in and around our business. Now, to highlight that, I've got a short video here. I am a organizational psychologist. I can do it, I can't say it. So what you won't be surprised to hear is there is a short task to do as part of this video. I'm going to hit play now. You should see the words awareness test come up. And all I need you to do is count how many times the team in white pass the ball between themselves. Right, so hopefully that played okay, and hopefully we counted along to 13 passes between that team in white. But the question is, how many of us saw the moonwalking bear in that video? So if you've seen this video before, then I do apologise. You almost certainly will have seen the moonwalking bear. But what we've done here is we've rewound this video, and from the right-hand side, in about a second, there we go. We have a bear come in, throw some shapes, and moonwalk off to the left-hand side. Now, provided that video played okay over this event, and provided you haven't seen a video like that before, or more specifically this video, around about 80% of people will miss that bear the first time they watch this video. Now that's really interesting because this is happening right in front of our eyes. Hopefully we're paying a decent amount of attention to the screen, and you know, we're actually looking, and our eyes couldn't be more centralized on this piece of footage. And yet 80% of people typically will miss that bear. Why am I talking about a bear that's dancing and us missing it? It's a really nice metaphor for the world of a manager. You know, a manager has their day-to-day job to do. They have their team to look after. Now more so than ever, they've probably got a dispersed team, you know, who they don't see every day. They can't read the room in the same way. So if our eyes are missing things that are happening right in front of our faces, how much stuff at any one time is a manager missing? And that's kind of, you know, that is the main reason for which we ask questions within Weekly 10. The employee experience stuff is a nice addition, but getting quality employee feedback is the heart of Weekly 10. So that's a very quick behavioural science overview. We can go into much more detail. I'm more than happy to, you know, have calls with you at an individual level to discuss any other areas and go into much more detail. But from that sort of very simplistic overview, we now move on to what we call our golden rules. So off of the back of, you know, this sort of behavioural knowledge that we have and our experience and the work we do with academic partners, we've developed a series of golden rules, and these are our 5 big ones around powerful questions. And they're all about, as it says sort of in that first line there, it's all about from an employee point of view, them thinking, I want to do it, it's easy to do it, and I know why I'm doing it. So let's jump in. Golden rule number 1, it's more of a way of thinking than a golden rule per se, but it's this idea that bad data is far worse than no data. And that's if you're running an old school employee survey, engagement survey, if you're doing a sort of interview question based thing, or if you're running a check-in in Weekly 10, no matter what sort of question setting exercise you're doing, bad data should be avoided at all costs. Now, this is something that we call here the Donald Rumsfeld uncertainty principle. It's a bit of a tongue twister, But what that means really is, for those of you who remember, Donald Rumsfeld back in the 2000s was Secretary of Defense of the US. And during the Second Gulf War, he gave a very famous press conference from the White House in which he left a lot of people confused. He was talking about things that we do and don't know about the world. And he used these three terms: known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And although confusing, it's actually quite pertinent to what we're talking about here when it's bad data versus no data. So if we have known knowns, these are things that we know for sure, or as close to certainty as possible that are the case. You know, if we know how things are happening within a certain team, we can go off and make changes. If we know that our sales performance over there isn't as good as it is over there, we can plot a strategy which ramps these guys up to the level of those guys over there. We can bank on that information. Equally, if we have known unknowns, this is our no data situation. If we have gaps in our knowledge and we recognize those gaps in our knowledge, we can plan. We can say, right, okay, well, we haven't got that yet, but let's go out and get it. And let's try strategy X, Y, and Z to make sure we get it. But it's these unknown unknowns, which are essentially bad data, which are really negative, and we want to avoid at all costs. Because if we have bad data, if we have these unknown unknowns, we waste time, we waste money, we waste effort, and all sorts of other bits and pieces are wasted chasing our own tails, essentially, trying to fix issues which don't necessarily exist, or don't necessarily exist in the way we think they do. So it's really important when it comes to data that we collect quality data. Now, one way to do that is to essentially not force people to answer the weekly 10 check-in, or not answer every single question every single week. So what you'll know using Weekly 10 is that by default, no question is set to mandatory status. You can obviously turn this on at a question level if you choose, but we always sort of sing the praises of trying to keep things as optional as possible, as flexible as possible for people to answer. Because what you find is, let's say you ask somebody a question and for genuine reasons, they don't have an answer to that question that week. What you would assume would happen in that scenario is that people would say, I can't answer this, or no answer this week, or something along those lines. But we know from studies into this sort of behaviour that, typically speaking, anywhere up to about a third of your people will actually make something up, exaggerate, take 5 minutes to think of something to write, and then end up writing 6 paragraphs on it to sort of blow it all out of proportion. They don't necessarily always just say, hands up, I don't know. So again, that's all about collecting really sort of poor data. Similarly, if you're using rating scale questions, so a 1 to 5, for example, make sure you always do use an odd number scale so that you can have a middle point, which allows somebody to essentially select a I don't know, I can't answer this option. Don't use an even number scale, so a 1 to 4, where actually wherever you score on that line, you're coming one side or the other of the argument. Because again, although quite minimal, over time, if you're building up lots and lots of data, that's going to have quite a significant effect if that data isn't accurate. So try to use mandatory settings sparingly, and when it comes to scale questions, make sure you use an odd number system. Continuing on with this point of bad data versus no data, there are 2 key other areas. So one is volume. So if you're a company of, let's say, 100+ employees, you probably have to pay slightly less attention to this point, but that doesn't mean switch off, because it's still certainly useful. But certainly volume is key when it comes to quality data. So what we talk about with our customers and with you guys on this point is that when it comes to things like individual responses within Weekly 10, it's best if managers react to those first in the first instance. What we find is that Weekly 10 is by far at its best when it facilitates better conversation between managers and employees. That's when it works at its absolute best. It's not about replacing one-to-ones or face-to-face conversations. It's about supporting those, and that's what should be happening hopefully already within your businesses. You know, managers should be booking one-to-ones off the back of feedback where required, and it's certainly the best strategy. What we don't want to see particularly is HR jumping on sort of a single answer from somebody and running with it, you know, coming up with all sorts of interesting new processes or ideas around what we can do around this one problem. Now, obviously, if it's a big red flag which needs jumping on by HR, then utilize your experience, you'll know what that is, and by all means, we're not saying don't react to anything, but don't be jumping on every single little piece of information you get back. Ask your managers to go in, have a conversation, and then if it needs escalating, great. The reason we say this is because we have seen in the past, you know, HR will jump on an answer, and they will spend time and money and effort trying to sort out whatever that piece of feedback was. And then actually, when you go back to that employee, they might have fallen into our category before of making something up or exaggerating something, or might have completely forgotten. They might have overblown the importance of that issue. So it's far better for you guys to let your managers have those one-to-ones and for HR to focus on trend analysis. So trend analysis is where your volume builds up. And if you are starting to see dips in sentiment or engagement scores in certain teams or locations or whatever it might be, that's a big red flag straight away for HR to get involved. But if everything looks smooth sailing, it's probably best for managers to have those one-to-ones before it gets escalated to the level of HR or leadership. The final point here is anonymity. So just like mandatory settings within Weekly 10, anonymity isn't turned on by default. Everything is open and honest. We truly believe that for open and honest two-way feedback is the key to having better conversations. And what we know is that anonymity really weakens the usefulness of data. It doesn't allow for any accountability. It doesn't empower managers to have those conversations. And although it feels like a safety net, people say, well, I can be a bit more honest if they don't know who said it. Well, if you can't then go and speak to that person and say, right, well, we want to try and resolve that issue for you, let's talk some more about it, the likelihood is you're never going to really crack that issue properly. So it's far better where possible to remove anonymity and have open and honest conversations. Obviously, there are certain questions, things like an employee net promoter score question, which is where you rate the likelihood of recommending your place to work to a peer on a scale of 1 to 10. Typically speaking, if you ask that question openly, you'll get lots of 9s and 10s because it's a really simplistic question where people can see the pros and cons on how they answer. So if I know that I'm going to have my name attached to my rating, I might think to myself, it's going to just be easier if I give you a 9 than give you a 6 or a 2, because that's going to lead to a follow-up question. So classically, an EMPS style question would be kept anonymous, but where you can, certainly try to avoid anonymity as much as possible. And you guys are all using Weekly 10 and are probably quite settled in that, the idea of keeping things open and honest. But if you need any support in sort of breaking down fences and making sure that people are happier within their workplace around that, giving feedback honestly, then reach out to either myself or your CSP or our support team, and we can certainly book in some conversations and training around that. Number 2, in terms of our golden rules. So number 2 is all about how much we can ask people within a check-in or any question setting exercise, but more specifically a check-in. And what you'll see here in orange is what essentially it's psychology's closest version of gravity, and it's just a long-standing theory which has never been disproven and is about as close to a truth as we have in psychology as we're likely to get. And it's this rule of 7 plus or minus 2. And what 7 plus or minus 2 means is, back in the 50s, research into memory and attention and a couple of other areas of cognition found that our brain has a capacity limit of somewhere between 5 and 9 pieces of information at any one time before it starts to become less effective at dealing with that information. So to break that down a little bit further, essentially when it comes to question setting exercises, an ideal maximum would be 9. With the Weekly 10 check-in, if you're using goals and OKRs, they are also included in this calculation. So if you've got questions and let's say goals, 9 is your ideal maximum split between those two things. So it might be 6 questions and 3 goals or whatever it might be, but ideally you'd go no more beyond 9. Now, it's not a cliff edge. It's not like you suddenly ask the 10th question and all of a sudden, as the top row of bullets say here, all of a sudden you see things like respondent fatigue, future avoidance, or people making things up. It's just the further away you get from that 9, that 7 plus or minus 2, the more likely it is that you'll start to see those negative impacts. And what we've done with research ourselves is within looking specifically at the Weekly 10 check-in, we know that the fewer questions you ask, leads to more attention being paid to questions, more detailed answers being given by respondents, more time spent answering questions too. So you just build up a better sort of quality level of quality feedback. So 7 plus or minus 2, you have a maximum of 9 to work with, and we can help you shape that to your specific requirements. So if you've got certain goals or certain questions you want to ask, pick up with myself, pick up with your CSPs or our support team, and we can book in and have a chat around that. Point 3, golden rule number 3, is all about mixing it up. So again, you guys are well versed in the world of Weekly 10 by now. You'll know how questions work in terms of setting them and the sort of questions that you're probably asking already. It's really important, if you're not already, though, to have a nice mix of the sort of questions you're asking. And what I mean by that is we have 2 different types of data in the world, so quantitative, so number-based, and qualitative, so text-based. And with Weekly10, we offer you options to sort of target both types of data. So in the quantitative side of things, we have things like rating scale questions, dichotomous questions, that is yes, no, true, false style questions, multiple choice questions. And then on the qualitative side, we have things like text boxes, we have recognition questions, and we also have comment boxes, which you can turn on and off for all questions, so to give people the space to actually write a little bit of detail alongside their, let's say, rating score. Why is it important to mix it up? Well, first of all, Weekly10 has a really advanced, sophisticated set of tools which are really good at looking at qualitative data. And this is a relatively new area of data analysis because it's all fed from AI and machine learning, which obviously has come on leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. And historically, qualitative data, text-based data, has been much harder for people to analyze than the quantitative stuff. Quantitative data numbers, they're relatively easy to understand. They're really nice to report back and they act as a nice benchmark. They're really good for quantitative. Our numbers are really good at telling us where things are at, but they're not so good at telling us why they're at where they're at. Whereas a qualitative, we can take that text, and as we do with our sentiment analysis, we can turn that into numbers, and we can give you, nice benchmarks and nice, easy things to report off the back of the qualitative. But what the qualitative also does is it tells us a story. With sentiment analysis and with just simply reading, people's responses, we can get a better understanding of why things are where they're at. Now, that's not to say there's no room at all for quantitative. Quantitative is really nice from an employee point of view because they're quick to do, they're easy to do. They're almost a little cognitive break for our brain when we're filling out our check-in if we get a qualitative question thrown in. So we definitely say that there's room for both. We tend to focus more on the qualitative side of things here, but certainly, a nice mix is probably the best way to go. Number 4, so Weekly10, as hopefully you're well aware by now, is really all about habit building. It's about people building habits around giving feedback, receiving feedback, reacting to feedback. It's about recognition and habits around that. It's about employee visibility and creating habits around that. The key, or the 2 keys really, to creating habits which last are frequency and simplicity. On this screen now, we're talking about frequency in particular. So there's an American author, an investor, and academic called Nir Eyal, who famously wrote a book called Hooked, which is all about products which really grab us and really help us build habits. He talks in the book about things like Spotify and how it's changed our habits when it comes to music listening. And what he talks about in that book is, that adopting new habits is really all about frequency. Now, simplicity certainly plays a part too, but frequency is really the main thing that he focuses on here. And certainly behavioral science will back him up on that. We know it's that old adage, right? Practice makes perfect. There is some science behind that saying too. The more we get to try something out, the more likely it is that we are going to A, start liking it, and B, become better at it, which in itself makes us like it further. Now, what we also know from the world of work is 96% statistically is an example of this from Gallup, actually. Gallup found that 96% of managers say that they're less anxious and better at giving feedback the more they do it. Again, it's that practice makes perfect principle. There are lots and lots of real world workplace benefits to practicing feedback more frequently. And then the pie chart is kind of our key point, really. And we know primarily from the world of educational psychology, so looking at teacher-student relationships, we know that when feedback is given, there is a window where that feedback remains as effective as it can be before it starts to tail off. Now, depending on what study and piece of research you read, typically that window is somewhere between 72 and 96 hours. And what happens after that, if a piece of feedback is given, let's say, beyond 96 hours after an event, the likelihood of that feedback impacting future performance starts to slowly diminish. Now, why? Well, because people forget what they did, why they did it, how they were feeling when they did it, and all this contextual information, which helps us really change our behavior moving forward. Now, again, it's not a cliff edge. You don't suddenly give a piece of feedback at 98 hours and all of a sudden it has no benefit. But what we do know from plenty of research is that actually that 96-hour window is a start of deterioration in quality. After about 2 weeks, it starts to really deteriorate. After about a month, it's pretty much 50-50 on if that feedback's ever going to have any impact on performance moving forward. So we know that just doing it more frequently, giving feedback more frequently, and running check-ins more frequently, and one-to-ones more frequently, are really going to help in terms of the quality of feedback that you give back to your people. On the opposite side of the same coin, in terms of building good habits, simplicity is really important. Number one, avoid jargon. I've already mentioned jargon before, but we know from research that we've done on our clients the huge impact that a piece of jargon can have. So we had a client in the southeast of England who has essentially three areas of the business. They have an office-based team, a factory-based team, and a traveling sales team. And participation in Weekly10 for their office-based team was superb. For their factory and sales team, far less so. Now, we did some investigation with them and done some interviews and did some checks. And what we identified was the main contributor to poor participation within the check-in was one single question, which used one single piece of jargon, which was very specific to the office-based team only. Now, what that was doing, it was leading probably to confusion for the factory and sales guys, but it was also highlighting to those guys that perhaps this question isn't for me, and therefore perhaps this process isn't for me, and therefore perhaps I shouldn't really be that interested in it. We mixed things up for them. We got them to ask that jargon-based question at a department level instead of an organizational level, and we changed some of the questions for the other guys, and their participation shot up. So we know that jargon can have a big impact on how likely people are to respond to questions. We also know point 2 here, keeping language simple is really important. So I mentioned before, for example, percentages. Now, there's a study in, I think, 2006, which it was looking at UK working professionals, looking at all sorts of different areas of work, and comprehension was one of them. And one statistic which always sticks in my mind is that as part of this study, of more than 2,000 adults, educated adults, white-collar workers typically, 4% of those people weren't sure that 50% off was the same as half price. And that really highlights sort of, we presume that people around us working in our locations where we work within our businesses have the same level of sort of understanding and confidence around language and things that we understand. Yet if 4% of 2,000, which is a fair chunk of people, can't openly say they don't really fully understand the difference between 50% and half price, or the fact they're two similar things or the same thing, it shows that actually perhaps our assumptions around other people's abilities aren't quite there. So you're far better, as an example, to sort of talk about half price instead of 50%. And this is sort of a well-founded statistic in the world of consumer psychology. It's why often you'll see half price written more frequently than 50%, because we know that people don't understand that. And that's just a nice example of, just when you're writing your questions, just consider, is there an easier way for me to say this? Because we need to make sure as many people as possible understand it. Because if people don't understand it, they become confused, they feel silly, and then we get that avoidance again. So we really want to avoid that. Point 3, check for biased or leading questions. Now, that sounds quite complex, and there is quite a science behind it. The simplest way to do that is simply to get someone else to check over your questions and go, can you have a read through that for me, please? Does that make sense? Any feedback? Because actually we're quite good, generally speaking, at spotting things like this, and if, it's very easy to miss your own biases and leading style questions when you're writing them, but somebody else checking over them, more often than not, will spot those. What you can also do, though, to avoid this, is you can utilise the Weekly10 question bank. So this launched properly last month. It's been something that's existed for a while as a PDF, and what it is, it's now available in the platform. What it is a library essentially of around about 80 or so questions, which we've written here, taken to one of our academic partners in North Wales, and got them to run a load of tests and efficacy tests on those questions to make sure that they don't contain any sort of biased language, leading language, discriminatory language. I mean, anything comes back goes into the question bank, and they're there for you to just essentially pick and choose what questions you might want to use, or just to act as some sort of level of help in terms of working out what questions you might want to ask, some inspiration. Point 4, don't write double barrel questions. So that's a relatively simple point, but make sure each question you're asking is only asking about one area. So a good example of this is, recently I found a rating style question for one of our customers saying, I believe that the friendliness and culture of this place to work is, and then there are 5 options. Now, whilst it's probably a fair assumption to think that friendliness and culture go relatively hand in hand, if I want to rate those 2 things differently, all of a sudden I can't because it's actually just one question. I've only got one rating scale to circle. So again, that might lead to some annoyance, some confusion. So just make sure we're only asking one question. 5, this relates back to what I was talking about earlier when it came to rating scales and making sure there's always a middle ground or an alternative option. So make sure there's an odd number on your rating scale so that you can leave a space for I don't know. And 6, we've already talked about as well, but don't set everything to mandatory. Give people the flexibility to not answer a question if they can't, because actually, if they can't answer it, the simplest option is for them to not answer it. So just allow them to do that and help them to do that. And then finally, point 5, show results. So this is a really important one, and it's something that we work a lot on with our clients and coming up with some really interesting ways of sort of showing the impact of Weekly 10 in a tangible way to your people, to employees. Because typically speaking, and we know this because we sell Weekly 10, we know if we sit down with a typical average employee in the typical average business in the world and say, we're a tool which is going to help improve your engagement and your performance, there'll be some level of interest, but not as much as there rightly is for business leaders, HR, because you guys you understand the benefits of those. And actually, generally speaking, a lot of those benefits are more sort of about the company as a whole, as opposed to the individual. So it's all about understanding and talking to employees about the benefits to them. And they care more about things like, making it a better place to work. They care more about potentially, helping them progress their careers, making performance reviews simpler, and all these other tangible benefits, which you don't necessarily talk about all the time when it comes to Weekly 10. And the best way to do this is through showing the results of what's happening in and around your business. So why is that important, first of all, jumping back slightly? Well, here we've got motivation. So the most basic model of human motivation talks about 3 key areas which drive motivation and make us want to do things. And those 3 areas are autonomy, so the power to be in control of what I'm doing, mastery, the power to be good at what I'm doing, and purpose, the power to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. Now, forgetting mastery for a minute, certainly purpose, obviously, if I'm filling out a weekly check-in and I never hear anything back, I don't get any feedback, I don't see what it's doing in and around the business, what it's changing, purpose isn't very clear. I don't really know why I'm doing this after a while. So it's important that I understand that. Also, you could argue autonomy. You're not really in control of actions if, again, you're not seeing the end result. You're only part of that cog. You're a cog in that machine, essentially, or that process. And actually, if I understood what it's leading to, I'm more autonomous. I'm more in control. I can give you better quality feedback because I understand what it's going to be used for. So it's really important that from that point of view, from motivating people to want to answer questions and give you good feedback, they understand where it's leading, and that's why we show results. Also, in the blue circle here, this comes from a behavioral psychologist, primarily comes from the behavioral psychologist called Dan Ariely, who works out of Duke University today in the States. Dan writes for Forbes, he writes for New York Times, he's always on the front page of TED, the talk website. And he talks a lot to people like Twitter, to IBM, to Uber, about the role that emotion plays in a workplace. And if you can get people to be emotionally attached to where they work, that really drives passion, it really drives value, it really drives commitment. If you can build a workplace where people actually care about the work they're doing and the work of the organization and care about the people within it, they are less likely to leave. They are more likely to work harder for you. They are more likely to give you discretionary effort. They will be engaged in what they're doing. Now, this is what Dan calls the I made it effect, or originally the IKEA effect. And that's because 15 years or so ago, he got a load of students to build some IKEA furniture, go out and sell it. He got a load of other students to just take some prefabricated furniture and go out and sell that. And he got them to come back and talk to them about the experience. And the guys that made their furniture, and this is only flat pack furniture, it's not like beautiful carpentry work, it's just flat pack IKEA furniture. The guys that made their furniture sold for a higher price, they missed their furniture, they wanted to be involved in follow-up studies, they pined and genuinely missed their furniture and said, brought them some level of sadness. The guys that weren't involved in the building of the furniture, they weren't very bothered. They sold for an average price, they didn't miss their furniture, they didn't really want to take part in any future studies. Now, what he shows here is that they built an emotional attachment, the guys who were building their furniture. They put a bit of effort in, it's the I made it factor. I'm helping to shape this, and therefore it's going to help strengthen my bond to it. So if we can show results in Weekly 10 or coming from Weekly 10, things that are happening in and around your business because of the feedback you're getting, it's really going to help strengthen that bond, and it's really going to help drive purpose and autonomy. So this is things like, quite simply, a manager giving someone a piece of feedback off the back of their feedback or a bit of commentary. That in and of itself is a result. That is something that's happening, a reaction to the action of me giving you feedback. But then you can look at sort of wider ideas. You can look at things like, if you have an internal newsletter or an intranet page, maybe having a section dedicated to, this is what you're telling us in Weekly 10, this is what we're doing about it. When you launch new ideas, new processes, if it's come off the back of Weekly 10, just remind people, you told us about this, so this is why it's here. This is for you because you wanted it. One of the nicest examples I know of is one of our UK-based clients. Their CEO will jump into the employee recognition feed in Weekly 10 once a month, I think it is, and he will pick out 3, 4, 5 great pieces of recognition feedback. What have people done well that other people haven't spotted and people have shared, and he'll pick up the phone, or he'll drop an email, or he'll go in person and see that individual and say, I saw so-and-so recognised you for that, and I just wanted to say thank you. And he'll shake their hand and he'll chat to them for a little while. Now, this company is around about 800 employees, so you don't see your CEO very often at that level, at that size. So actually, the impact of seeing your CEO not only come down and talk to you, but in terms of your peers around you seeing that as well, seeing that, oh, well, so-and-so got a handshake and a visit from the CEO or a phone call from the CEO and a personal thank you. That's huge in terms of sort of showing results, drawing more people into the process. And at an individual level, it's really helpful, from prospects in terms of future opportunities and growth if you are being recognised by your leader or your leadership. So that's a really nice example, which not everyone is going to be able to utilise, but it's a great one to try. And finally, moving away from our rules to some more practical advice, just a few slides on what sorts of questions you should be asking. Now, as I said before, I usually run this on a one-to-one basis or face-to-face basis with customers. And even in that scenario, I never know our customer as well as they do. So I don't give specific questions right off the bat. That's what we work to eventually. So these aren't going to give you specific questions necessarily, but it's really good guidance to follow if you're looking to refresh or relaunch your question setting. So let's recap on a couple of bits we've seen already. How many questions should we be asking? Well, it all depends on whether or not you're asking you're setting OKRs or goals within the platform. If you're not, then you have up to 9 questions. If you are, you need to strike a bit more of a balance. Now, typically OKRs, you typically would set maybe 3. Goals tend to average out somewhere between 3 or 4. So if you're utilising 3 or 4 of your 9 spaces for that, you'll have somewhere between 5 and 7 spaces for questions. So just remember, everything within the check-in needs to be ideally no more than 9. If next week you need to go out and ask 12, don't worry about it too much. It's just try to always keep it to that 7 plus or minus 2. And remember, the fewer is actually the better. So if you could get away with asking 3 questions every week, then great, because actually you're more likely to get 100% or close to 100% participation than you are if you asked 6 or 9. But we know that 9 is a safe sort of boundary. So try to keep it to no more than that. 10 pulse. So if you're wanting to benefit from the 10 pulse employee engagement metric, which is what we derive from the back of our sentiment analysis. So this is our numerical score, which you will see on your organization tab, which tells you not only how your overall engagement is, but how engagement is against 5 key pillars of employee engagement. It requires certain questions to be asked within the check-in. Now, it definitely requires a positive question, some sort of question around successes or what's gone well. It helps to have a negative question as well to balance it out. It makes the 10 pulse score even more accurate. So if you can ask a question around challenges or blockers or issues, then that helps. It's also a really important question to ask anyway, we believe, because understanding where things are going wrong for your people is key in helping them develop and supporting them to develop. And then finally, you do also need, as well as needing a positive question, you do also need a recognition style question or a social question. So something around, who's doing well within the business, or who needs a shout out, or would you like to give some kudos to one of your colleagues? Question variety. So this relates in some ways to that mix it up point we made earlier. When it comes to the questions you ask, ideally you should be using what we call a core flexi approach to questions. Core questions are questions which are in every check-in you ask. These are, if you're using 10 pulse, it will certainly at least be a success question and a recognition question. These are also questions that you are checking in on all the time, and are that central to what you do as a business, that you need to be asking them frequently. And ideally, these are always here. These will be in every check-in that you run until you need a full refresh. And then on the opposite side of that, we have our flexi questions. Now, flexi questions are just a big list of questions that you've created that you will essentially utilize as the year goes on at the cadence which works for you. So it might be that you ask a question once a month, you might ask it once a quarter, you might ask it once a year. You might only ask it the 16th of April and never again. These are questions which they tackle everything and everything. So they're there to tackle, cultural-based questions and well-being and remote working, and they can be really flippant and fun things. It could be, do you want a dodgy disco DJ at the Christmas party, or would you rather have a live band? And it's fine to use Weekly 10 occasionally for those sorts of questions, because actually, A, they're a bit of fun, and for the people that are utilising Weekly 10 already, it's a nice novel thing to see and a bit of a different edge. But also it helps draw people who currently are a bit more apprehensive about using the platform, who perhaps are a little bit tougher to crack in terms of getting their participation up. It's a hook to get them back in as well. It's just understanding, what questions can we be asking also to help drive participation. And if you think of something, then test it out and give it a go and see if it works. But yeah, so have some core questions which you always have in, and have some flexible ones which come in and out as you require them. And with the new question setting experience, which launched last month, it's become easier than ever now to sort of set that flexi schedule. So you can at a question level now just set any sort of scheduling you require. And then finally, sort of in terms of me talking today, our example questions. So these have all come out of our question bank. And what we have here is a breakdown. So we have our core questions. So for this example, and this is only examples, you don't have to use any of this, but this is a typical good sort of template to follow. You'd have some core questions. So you might have a positive, you might have a negative, you might have a recognition piece. And then you have what we call core flexi questions, actually. So these are things that used to be flexible, but have got real impact and benefit to being asked. That they're almost core now in terms of the frequency in which we see people using them. So that's typically a question around development. So is there any support you need, a kit you need, training you need? How can we help you, basically? Those sorts of questions. That's really important, because from a purpose point of view and an autonomy point of view, it really powers that motivational hook, or those two motivational hooks. Because purpose, I understand if I answer this question, I'm going to get something out of it, and that's really beneficial. Equally, that's autonomous, right? If you're asking for help in getting it, well, you're helping yourself in a way. So it's really good for driving autonomy. The one-to-one question is one of my favorite questions that I see frequently within the platform. And it's something along the lines of, is there anything you'd like to add to the agenda for our upcoming one-to-one? Now, good one-to-ones, good performance reviews, quarterly reviews, any sort of one-to-one conversation with your employee, good versions of those conversations are about one thing, and that's about your employee. It's about development and improving and pushing towards success of that employee. So why, if it's about employees, why wouldn't they have a say in what's going to be discussed? And why wouldn't they be able to shape that conversation? It makes that conversation, and it should be a conversation, don't forget, it shouldn't be a one-way manager talking only to employee. It should be a two-way thing. It makes that conversation more focused and more actionable and more relevant to the employee. So by asking them, what do you want in your upcoming one-to-one? What do you want in your upcoming performance review? Is there anything we need to be talking about from your point of view? It really helps sort of sell the idea that you genuinely aren't just asking questions for the sake of it. It's genuinely about them. It's genuinely about trying to improve workplace culture or whatever it might be to help them. So that's a really nice question we see a lot of. And then the flexible questions, there's just some examples there, really. So as I said before, we've got a culture question. We have that EMPS question I mentioned earlier. But these are just purely examples, and your list of flexible questions could be 5, like it is here, or it could be 500, and you utilize flexible questions to give you information about niche areas of the business or seasonal specific times of the year or whatever it might be. So your flexible questions could be anything you need them to be, really. So that's it in terms of me talking at you today. Hopefully you found this session useful. Certainly we'll move on to the Q&As in a second, but what I'll do off the back of this, our marketing team will reach out to you and send you a recording of this session. They'll also send you this guide. So this is our guide to asking powerful questions. It covers some of the science that we've talked about here today. It goes into some more detail in other areas. And it actually just really helps sort of, it's a nice resource to give out to your managers or maybe even to shape a workshop around, just to help you sort of think about the questions you're asking in Weekly 10 and in other workplace scenarios, and just hopefully sort of fine-tune those a little bit. So that's it from me. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to move over to our Q&A and see if we've had any questions come in. So bear with 2 seconds, guys, just while the technology catches up with me. Right, a couple of questions by the looks. Right, okay, yeah. So question 1, how often should questions be getting refreshed? This is a really common question. So the simple answer is when they need to be. There's no set cadence to refreshing questions. Now, if you're seeing really good participation rates and you're getting really good quality feedback, there's no reason to change your questions unless you feel they need it for some reason. If your participation rates, say, are below 70% and are struggling to get to 70%, and or the quality of feedback you're getting isn't great and not all that actionable, then it's probably time for a question refresh. We can obviously help with that as well. So if you're looking at your data today and going, is this good, is this bad, have we asked these questions too long, reach out to us. We can have a look with you, we can do a bit of a review, and we can also help you shape those questions if needed. So yeah, hopefully that one's useful. Next question here is, can I get access to the question bank you mentioned? Yes, you can. So question bank, it does exist in PDF form. So if you ever require a PDF of it, you can have that by all means, but it is now live in the platform. It went live about 2-3 weeks ago in the platform. So to access it, all you need to do is under your My Team or your organization tab, you need to go to questions page, and then you need to ask a new question or set a new question. And then what should happen there is you'll be presented with 2 options. You'll be presented with the option to create your own question, or you'll be presented with the option to open the question bank. And from there, you can browse our 80 questions. I think they're split by sort of topic and focus. You can create a little shopping basket of questions by adding them into a shopping basket. And then when you're happy with the questions you've got, you just click OK or save, and it'll add those questions straight into your next check-in. Hopefully that one answered that one. What we got here? What's a good answer rate for a question? If ours is low, should we scrap the question? So yeah, as I sort of answered that one previously, but we typically set a participation rate. So this is actually people answering week in, week out, something at least within the check-in, of 70%. Gold standard is anything above 80%. If we can get 80% off, we're pretty happy. That's a pretty good rate, and that's not just based on us being happy at 80%. It's based on sort of, again, the history and the science of question setting processes, and you always get people that for one reason or another, quite often genuine reasons, quite often less so, don't participate, but 80% is ideal, 70% is the minimum. When it comes to a specific question percentage, it's probably quite contextual or context specific. It depends on what a question is. Is that question, is it a core question, first of all? And if it is, then you should be aiming for at least 82%, I would imagine. But if it's a flexible question and you ask it a couple of times a year and you find it's not generating a lot of feedback, it depends on the quality of the feedback it is generating, I guess. So it'd be something for us to review with you and help you out with. Right, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in at the moment. So I think we're done, guys. So I'll hold on for another second or two in case there's any more questions, but yeah, thank you for joining us today. We're finishing 5 minutes early, so that's always a benefit. Thanks for your time. Hope you found it all useful. My contact details are on screen now, so if you need me at all, please do feel free to drop me an email. Actually, that's our old phone number, so please don't utilise that right now. But if you drop me an email, chris@weekly10.com, if you've got any questions or if you need any support with anything. Equally, as I said before, if you reach out to your CSP or our support team, they can also get you in touch with me if you can't get through to me direct. As I said, you'll get an email over the next couple of days with a link to the recording and that question guide that I mentioned. And unless there's anything else, guys, thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the world, and speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye.